Good afternoon. I'm Deacon John Robbins, and I'm very sorry that I am not able to be with you in person today to talk, pray, and reflect on how we can best hear God's voice in the clatter of modern life. Today, we'll talk about distractions, the in depth technological tactical competition for our attention. We'll explore our prayer life and we'll reflect upon sacred scripture. It's my sincere hope, and it has been my prayer as I've been preparing this, that this will bear good fruit for all of us and be an enjoyable communal experience for everyone, uh, even with my physical absence, which could not be avoided. Allow me to start by introducing myself. I am the communications director for the Archdiocese of Dubuque, where I've worked in a few different roles over the past 11 years. My wife Sadie is a native of Dubuque, and we have three children, a 10-year-old daughter and two boys who are 7 and 5. I was to the permanent diaconate in July of 2019 and am assigned to Resurrection Parish. Now, when David McDermott and I began to speak about our topic today, there was, as I said, a discussion of in depth technological communication strategies that deal with a very real, constant competition for our attention. I think this interesting topic that explores communication in our world is why I was asked to speak. Uh, but we also recognize the need to apply that to our lives and our relationship with others and the Lord. And so that's where we'll begin today. The first portion of today's discussion will focus on the story of young Samuel hearing the Lord speak to him in the temple during the silence of the night. Now, one could reasonably say, wait a minute there, John. This discussion today is supposed to be about hearing God in the noise. And you start with Samuel sleeping in the temple on a quiet night. I do, but we're building on a theme. Our discussion will crescendo. So thanks for extending a line of credit to me and hanging in there with me. So we know the story of young Samuel. His mother Hannah longed for a child and told the Lord in prayer that if she was given a male child, she would give him back to the Lord. She prayed long and fervently, and the priest Eli noticed this and told her that God would grant her request. While in time, Samuel was born and presented to the Lord and then stayed at the temple. Hannah would visit him when she came to the temple, according to the custom and the Mosaic law. And there's more to the story, but that's a reminder of the most necessary background information. And so here we have the account of Samuel hearing the Lord speak to him. I've chosen the selection from our lectionary, what we read every 3 years at Holy Mass, Sunday Mass, on the second Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year B. So most recently, we read this at Mass last January. Get my lectionary here. Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. The Lord called to Samuel, who answered, "Here I am." Samuel ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "Well, I did not call you," Eli said. "Go back to sleep." So he went back to sleep. Again the Lord called Samuel, who rose and went to Eli. But Eli answered, "I did not call you, my son. Go back to sleep." At that time, Samuel was not familiar with the Lord, because the Lord had not revealed anything to him as of yet. The Lord called Samuel again for the third time. Getting up and going to Eli, he said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the youth. So he said to Samuel, "Go to sleep, and if you are called, reply, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. When Samuel went to sleep in his place, the Lord came and revealed his presence, calling out as before, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel answered, Speak, for your servant is listening. Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him, not permitting any word of his to be without effect. This account of Samuel hearing the Lord is one that's very special to me. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening, is the simple prayer that I pray each time I prepare a homily. And I prayed it as I prepared for this discussion. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Now, my children also have a special connection to this story for a couple of reasons. First, I will often sing them to sleep, at least my younger two these days. And one of their favorite songs to have sung to them as they're falling asleep is the hymn, Here I Am, Lord, inspired by this account of young Samuel in the temple. Additionally, and this was more true for my daughter when she was younger, um, my children have older cousins in the family named Sam and Eli. And so as a young child, she enjoyed the story simply because it called to mind both of those older cousins who she thought were pretty cool. Now, although Speak, Lord, your servant is listening is simple and easy to say, my experience is that it is much harder to follow or to live. When I'm preparing a homily or really looking to the Lord for direction in life, there are times when I'll pray this and then immediately realize, no, wait, I want this to be true. I want to honestly be able to say to the Lord, I am listening to you right now. But I realize that I'm actually putting myself in a position to not listen with my whole heart. I'm failing to listen with my whole heart. You know, I want to have a certain background music on when I'm preparing or spending time in prayer, or as I'm reading scripture or again preparing a homily. It's okay if the TV is on as long as it's muted. Um, that's a distraction too, even when it's muted. To really listen as God speaks to what Saint Benedict called the ear of the heart requires both surrender and obedience. We need to let go of the distractions. And for me, it's that music or that TV show on mute. And I find that I'm so connected with this constant influx of data that it's become comfortable and normal. And what's abnormal or atypical is silence in my life. Even if it's late at night after my kids have gone to bed and I'm preparing a homily, there is almost no silence in my life. And so I've come to learn that I need to give God my heart and mind through obediently silencing these distractions at certain times and doing so more regularly. And then when I accomplish that, it can still be difficult to turn off the noise of my thoughts. I am prone to relive experiences from each day and give more attention to situations that have already concluded, or to be focused on scenarios that I can't control or maybe even haven't happened yet. So this internal noise is also a distraction that I try to turn off. I think an interesting point of reflection is that Samuel needed assistance from Eli to help discern God's voice. Now, today I'm leaning on the reflections of Dr. John Bergsma, and when reflecting upon this account of young Samuel hearing the Lord, he says the following. At the beginning of the reading, Samuel's relationship to God is mediated through his adopted father, the priest Eli. But by the end of the narrative, Samuel has learned to hear God for himself. We all have to go through this maturation of faith, he says. And sometimes, as in the case of Samuel, this maturation and personalization calls us to move beyond the spirituality given to us by our parents, mentors, or previous generations into a deeper and more radical faith. And so now I have some reflection questions. I'll read them and then we'll display them momentarily. Was your spirituality passed on to you by someone? A parent, another family member, a mentor? Did that spirituality involve discussion or instruction on listening to God in prayer? What is the hardest part of this prayerful listening process? Or, if intentionally trying to listen to the Lord is a new spiritual and prayerful exercise for you, what difficulties do you anticipate? So, I'll have some help in displaying these questions now for your reflection. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Our second portion of today's discussion will focus on the story of Elijah hearing the Lord on the mountain of God in the tiny whispering sound, or another translation that is common calls it the still small voice. We know this account as well. The backstory or context is this. Elijah is fleeing the wicked Jezebel, the queen of Israel at the time, who was opposed to the prophets and murdering them. She is particularly opposed to Elijah, and so he is on the run and heads to the very mountain where God has appeared to Moses. Once he arrives on that mountain, Elijah and God converse. So let's look at the circumstances of how God speaks to Elijah and how Elijah hears the voice of God. Once again, I've chosen a selection from our lectionary. So this is what we read every 3 years at Sunday Mass on the 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year A. At the mountain of God, Elijah came to a cave where he took shelter. Then the Lord said to him, "Go outside and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will be passing by." A strong and heavy wind was rending the mountains and crushing rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire there was a tiny whispering sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. So the verses that follow are when Elijah and God converse more. Elijah recognized God's presence in that tiny whispering sound. God asks a question to which he already knows the answer, but allows Elijah to give voice to his struggles, which he describes as the Israelites forsaking the covenant, tearing down altars, and killing other prophets, which is why he's on the run for his life. God lets Elijah know that his plan for his life is not yet over, and he ultimately leads him to his successor, Elisha. In another reflection from Dr. Bergsma, we see parallels to our discussion today. He says, the readings address the struggle of the believer to stay in relationship with God in the face of overwhelming distractions and threats. In the midst of wind and earthquakes, the voice of God still speaks to us. Now, regarding Jesus, and how could we gather today and not speak his name? The lectionary pairs this Old Testament account of Elijah and the still small voice, or tiny whispering sound, of God to Matthew's gospel account of Peter desiring to walk on water with Jesus. After he had fled the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain to pray by himself. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, Dr. Brant Petrie is another contemporary scholar who I enjoy reading and learning from. In his book, The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ, he discusses this passage from Matthew's Gospel in the ninth chapter, titled, "Did Jesus Think He Was God?" Now, we know Jesus is God, the eternal Son, the ancient God of Israel, come in human flesh, and Dr. Petrie makes this point. In discussing this account, he points out that the Greek word for worship can either refer to homage given to human beings, such as kings, or worship given to the one God alone. And while it takes time for the disciples to unpack the true identity of Jesus, they do recognize that Jesus has just manifested divine power over the sea. And as a result, they worship him as divine. In fact, the Catholic RSV, Revised Standard Edition translation of the Bible, doesn't say those who were in the boat did him homage, but translates that word into English as those who were in the boat worshipped him. So again, the lectionary from which we read at Holy Mass pairs these two passages together, and on both occasions, God speaks. What does this mean for our conversation today? Well, again, here's what John Bergsma has to say about this. Jesus called to Peter, "Come," just as he beckons to each one of us. The challenge is to focus on the still small voice of Jesus beckoning to us, to walk toward him by concentrating on fulfilling our vocation daily, and not capitulate or surrender to fear of the chaos that rages around us. And listen to these words of his, because I think they represent the heart of what we have been asked to discuss today, and are the perfect transition into another set of questions for reflection, and then our third and final segment of the afternoon. Listen to these words of Dr. Bergsma. The whole narrative of Elijah on the mountain is a critique of judging reality by the external and dramatic, a reading of history that focuses on what gets screamed in headlines. The external, dramatic, and visible in human history, and I think he's also saying our lives today, does not always reveal the hand of God. Yet God is always living and active, working in human hearts in ways that we do not recognize or notice. Those who seek holiness in life must train themselves not to vacillate with the headlines, but raise up the next generation. and be confident that God will preserve his flock through the turmoil of history. And I believe that he intends to include the turmoil of our present day as well. That's such a powerful, relevant point of reflection for us. Allow me to summarize parts of it again. This is really the heart of what we are discussing today. This account of Elijah not hearing God in the wind or the earthquake, but rather the still small voice, is a critique of judging reality by the external and dramatic of that which is often screamed in our headlines and which does not always reveal the hand of God. We need to train ourselves to listen to God speaking to the ear of our hearts and not vacillate with the headlines of our day. And so training ourselves to do this and training the next generation or generations is necessary to helping them encounter the Lord who is active and working or speaking in ways that we may not otherwise recognize or notice. I suspect that some of you are familiar with Sarah Christmeyer. She is a Catholic author, Bible teacher, speaker, and co-developer and co-founding editor of the Great Adventure Catholic Bible Study. She has a blog entry and reflection titled, "Are You Listening? God Wants to Speak." After her reflection, she lists a couple questions which I am borrowing for our reflection. Here they are. Are you ever distracted by other noise in your life from listening to Jesus? What will it take to find silence? How can you be truly present in order to hear? And then she gives us this guidance. Begin to pray and ask the Lord what you need to do to become a better hearer and doer of the word. So again, we'll put those questions up for reflection, and then when you're done, we'll begin the third and final portion of our discussion today. And so now we have come to the third and final portion of our discussion today. In early discussions, I was asked to examine the communications climate in which we live and operate and apply that to our lives as Catholics. And I mean early discussions with those who planned this event. We're specifically interested now in exploring what is called the attention economy and tribalism, and how both affect us because we need to be aware that no matter what we are reading or watching, there are motives behind the information presented to us that go beyond conveying the truth. Often that motive is profit. Attention economics is an approach to management of information that treats human attention as a scarce commodity and applies economic theory to solve various information management problems. This topic has been summarized by the observation that attention is a resource, and a person only has so much of it. The following is a summary from an online article published by a firm that focuses on research-based consumer experiences. They say, attention is one of the most valuable resources in the digital age. For most of human history, access to information was limited. Centuries ago, many people could not read, and education was a luxury. Today, we have access to information on a massive scale. Facts, literature, and art are available, often for free, to anyone with an internet connection. We are presented with a wealth of information, but we have the same amount of mental processing power as we have always had. The number of minutes has also stayed exactly the same in every day. Today, attention not information, is the limiting factor. Excuse me. Attention is a valuable resource to us as individuals. This resource is also valued by businesses, political campaigns, nonprofits, and countless other organizations that try to entice us to spend money or even give of our time. In the late 90s, a gentleman named Michael Goldhaber wrote that the global economy is shifting from a material based economy to one that is based on the capacity of human attention. Many services online are offered for free. In the attention economy, attention is not only a resource, but a currency. Users pay for a service with their attention. Today, the dynamics of the attention economy incentivize companies to draw users in to spend more and more time on apps and sites. Designers who create sites and apps understand that their products vie for the limited resource of users' attention in a highly competitive market. The hope of attracting attention has led to the popularity of many different design trends, and they suggest that these mainly degrade the user experience, such as eye-catching animations that call attention to a piece of content, or busy, crowded designs where a large amount of information is shown at once in hopes that one of the many images or phrases will attract users' notice. So our attention is highly sought after and translates to a type of currency that often results in us spending money on a particular product or service. Corporations, institutions, and campaigns understand this, and at times we are victims of our own bad habits. In the worst of times, we're taken advantage of. But how? Well, that's what we'll explore now as we begin to talk about tribalism. The following is taken from a recent interview with a social psychologist. It happens to keep appearing in my smartphone's newsfeed. Perhaps because I clicked on it once, stayed on the site long enough to read it, and now they know I'm interested in it. Huh. Again, this interview, in my opinion, paints an accurate picture of our society, particularly showing how we can be taken advantage of by tech firms who know our habits and lead us to a more unhealthy society, and I would also say an unhealthy, divided church. When talking about tribalism and polarization, this social psychologist says the major dynamic here is called the polarization cycle. Not all conflicts are polarization cycles, but you get such cycles when you have two groups at either extremes. Groups that each believe they are in an existential struggle for survival. Especially when you have a media environment that feeds the worst statements and actions of the other side, instead of the average statements and actions. Now, this is not true of all media outlets, especially local media outlets that exist to serve their community. I do feel a responsibility to say that. So each side is driven towards more and more passion by all the stories that supposedly confirm the radicalization of the other side. Both sides believe the end justifies the means, so neither side will care about due process and law. Victory must be had at all cost. Then, yes, you get a polarization cycle. And the social psychologist says in America, we are absolutely experiencing a polarization cycle. It's always been the case, he says, that extremes are louder. But what happened between 2009 and 2012 is that American tech companies created an outrage machine. This outrage machine greatly amplified the power of the extremes. The extremes got nastier and nastier, so that the people in the middle, and the middle make up about 80 or 90%, now feel so intimidated that they largely keep quiet. Perhaps that rings true for many of us. We need to work more proactively to turn into star listeners. Ooh, isn't that interesting? This recent interview with a contemporary social psychologist is affirming what we have covered here today. We need to listen. Back to his quote. We need to learn how to listen and what the other side is really saying instead of simply trying to make the other side adopt our outlook. Uh, how do we go about this? He asks. It's very hard to do directly. The human mind, he says, has two basic patterns. When people are in explore mode, they see opportunity and are curious and want to learn. When people are in defend mode, they see only threats and are not open to learning. They cling to their team and want to defeat the other team. You cannot just make people listen unless you first put them in explore mode. This is very hard to do in the public square. But if you go institution by institution, he postulates, we might be able to make a difference. So here's my personal take. Wouldn't it be nice if Catholics everywhere decided that the church would be the first institution that made that difference? The first to be in explore mode, almost always, rather than defend mode. Now, I'm not saying that we abandon defending our faith, certainly not. But maybe explore mode, in a Catholic sense, looks like accompaniment and journeying together rather than arguing. In my humble opinion, this is one way of understanding the papacy of Francis. But remember, exploring doesn't mean anything goes. On the contrary, in this context, it means we are curious and want to learn. And I think it's also interesting, and there are others who know more about this than I do, but one of the most popular models of discipleship from the past decade has four thresholds of conversion leading to discipleship. And they seem to fit this exploring pattern. They are trust, curiosity, openness, and seeking. Four thresholds of conversion according to a contemporary popular model that leads to discipleship. Back to the words of the social psychologist, what we should have in our institutions are policies that, as much as possible, seek to put everyone in explore mode. People would then be curious and also listen more. Now, this contemporary social psychologist is not approaching the topic from a faith perspective, although he naturally incorporates religious perspectives and influences into his work. But as I've already begun to tease out, there is much that we can borrow and apply to our lives and to the current state of affairs of the church today. In my role as communications director, I serve as a liaison between the emails that are submitted through the Archdiocesan website and their intended recipient at the Chancery, or Pastoral Center, as we call it. All too often, I see a message from a member of the faithful in our archdiocese, and sometimes a different diocese, and sometimes I don't know where they're from, but a message from the faithful who is operating from a defend mode rather than an explore mode. Such a person does not appear to have an interest in learning why or what is behind the words or actions that upset them. They're not interested in asking questions. They immediately see ill will as the motive for various church leaders and therefore see only threats and are not open to learning. It's not something that I can completely exonerate myself from either. I'm not completely innocent. I think we all fall victim to making incorrect assumptions when something doesn't appear to jive with our comfort level or perception of what is proper or just or true or beautiful. But again, rather than first exploring or asking, we often defend or assume. In the midst of my imperfections, I have come to realize the paradox of learning, that the more I know, the more I realize I don't know much of anything. And that keeps me grounded. It also provides a spiritual thirst. There is so much to explore. Our Catholic faith is so rich and so vast, and few, if any of us, are able to learn all that we want to learn about the faith. But in that reality, we need to be reminded that our goal is not to accumulate information, but rather to experience a transformation through a relationship with Jesus and encourage such transformations in others that manifests itself in a communal worship experience, one that is passed down through generations and can sometimes, in the words of Dr. John Bergsma, which I quoted earlier, call us to move beyond the spiritual approach of our parents, mentors, or previous generations into a deeper faith. This doesn't mean that we abandon the beauty of what we have received. Far from it. It probably means that we enter more deeply into that beauty. Well, that concludes our third and final portion on the attention economy and tribalism. So allow me to attempt to summarize our afternoon, starting with that beautiful reflection on Elijah hearing the Lord. The whole narrative is a critique of judging reality by the external and dramatic, a reading of history that focuses on what gets screamed in headlines. The external, the dramatic, the visible in human history does not always reveal the hand of God. Yet God is always living and active, working in human hearts in ways that we do not recognize or notice. Those who seek holiness in this life must train themselves to not vacillate with the headlines, but raise up the next generation and be confident that God will preserve his flock through the turmoil of history. And let's finish with those challenging reflections once more from author and speaker Sarah Christmeyer. Are you ever distracted by other noise in your life from listening to Jesus? What will it take to find silence? How can you truly be present in order to hear? And let's remember her challenge to each of us, to me and to you. Begin to pray and ask the Lord what you need to do to become a better hearer and doer of the word. Again, I hope that this was a fruitful event. I thank you for being here, and I am sorry that I could not be here in person. God bless you.